The soft chime of the automatic doors rang through the near-empty grocery store as Margaret adjusted the strap of her apron. It had been a slow evening, the kind where time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The fluorescent lights above flickered, faintly, casting a cool glow over the aisles of neatly stacked goods. She had worked here for years, long enough to recognize the regulars by their shopping habits alone. Just as she was about to check the time again, the front doors slid open, allowing in a gentle rush of cold air. An elderly man shuffled inside, his movements slow and deliberate. Margaret had seen him before, many times in fact. He wasn't a man of many words, but he always greeted her with a kind smile, the kind that carried the weight of years behind it. Tonight, however, there was something different about him. His steps were hesitant, his expression troubled. Margaret watched as he moved through the aisles, picking up a few essentials: bread, milk, a small carton of eggs. His hands trembled slightly as he placed each item into his basket. When he finally made his way to her register, he let out a weary sigh, setting the basket down with careful precision. "Evening, sir," Margaret greeted, scanning his items. The old man nodded, offering a tired smile. "Evening, dear." She pressed the total button, and the screen displayed the final amount. The man reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He opened it slowly, his fingers sifting through a few crumpled bills and loose change. His movements grew slower as he counted, and soon his shoulders slumped in defeat. Margaret could see it in his eyes before he even spoke. I don't think I have enough," he murmured, mostly to himself. He started to push the eggs aside, then hesitated, looking at the bread as if deciding which was more important. Something about the moment made Margaret's heart tighten. She had seen struggles before, mothers carefully budgeting their groceries, young college students putting back items they couldn't afford. But this was different. There was something about the old man's quiet resignation that struck a chord deep within her. Without thinking twice, she reached into her own pocket and pulled out her wallet. It wasn't much, just a few bills from her last paycheck. But she didn't hesitate. "It's all right," she said softly, sliding the money into the register. "I've got it covered." The old man's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as if he might refuse. But there was something in her expression, genuine kindness maybe, that made him pause. His lips quivered as he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, dear." Margaret only smiled, brushing it off as nothing. As he gathered his groceries, the old man hesitated once more. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then simply gave her a long, meaningful look before nodding again and turning toward the exit. Margaret watched him go, feeling warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the first time she had helped a customer in need, and it wouldn't be the last. She never expected anything in return. It was just who she was. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, and by the time her shift ended, she had all but forgotten the encounter. She walked home through the quiet streets, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. Life would go on as usual, or so she thought. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of the mail slot clicking open. She groggily got out of bed, stretching as she walked to the front door. A small pile of letters sat on the floor, mostly the usual bills and advertisements. But one envelope stood out, a plain cream-colored one, with her name written neatly across the front. Frowning, she picked it up, turning it over in her hands, before carefully tearing it open. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a check for an amount that made her hands shake as she held it. Margaret's heart pounded as she stared at the name signed at the bottom. The old man, the very same one she had helped the night before. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Where had he gotten this money? Why had he sent it to her? Had she unknowingly helped someone far more significant than she realized? And then, her eyes fell on a small note tucked inside the envelope. Just a few short sentences. But as Margaret read them, her entire world shifted. Margaret's fingers trembled as she carefully unfolded the small note tucked inside the envelope. The paper was slightly crinkled, as if it had been held tightly before being placed inside. Her eyes darted over the words, written in neat, slanted handwriting. You reminded me that kindness still exists in this world. I hope this helps you, as much as you helped me. Walter. That was his name. She had never known it before. Margaret sank onto her couch, the check still clutched between her fingers. It wasn't just a generous amount, it was life-changing, enough to cover months of rent, to pay off some lingering debts, even to finally fix the sputtering heater in her apartment. But that wasn't what left her speechless. It was the mystery behind it. Walter had hesitated that night at the register, struggling to pay for a few simple groceries. Where had this money come from? Why had he chosen to give it to her? The questions swirled in her mind, leaving her restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple act of gratitude. By the time she arrived at the grocery store for her next shift, the mystery had taken root deep inside her. She couldn't ignore it. Margaret, you all right? Her co-worker, Lisa, asked as they both stacked shelves. Margaret blinked, realizing she had been staring off into space. Yeah, just thinking. Lisa smirked. About what? Don't tell me you finally got a secret admirer. Margaret let out a short laugh, but shook her head. No, nothing like that. Just, do you know anything about that old man who comes in here a lot? The one with the grey coat, always buys the same stuff. Milk, bread, eggs. Lisa frowned, tapping her chin. Walter? Yeah, I've seen him around. Quiet guy. Lives a few blocks down, I think. Why? Margaret hesitated, then sighed. He sent me something. A check. A big one. Lisa's eyebrows shot up. Wait! Walter sent you money? Like a lot of money? Margaret nodded, lowering her voice. I paid for his groceries last night. He looked like he was struggling, so I just covered it. Next morning, I get this check in the mail with a note. Lisa let out a low whistle. Wow, either you helped a secret millionaire, or something weird is going on. That thought had already crossed Margaret's mind. Walter didn't seem like a man who had much. His clothes were well worn, his hands rough with age, and yet Margaret decided she needed to find out the truth. After her shift, she walked toward the neighborhood Lisa had mentioned. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant fireplaces and freshly fallen leaves. Her footsteps felt heavy, a mix of nerves and curiosity guiding her forward. She found the street easily enough. Small, quiet houses lined the sidewalk, their porch lights flickering as the sun dipped lower in the sky. She scanned each one, looking for any sign of Walter. Then, at the end of the street, she spotted it, a modest single-story house with a small overgrown garden. Something about it felt lonely. Margaret hesitated at the front steps, taking a steadying breath before knocking gently on the door. Seconds passed. Then, the door creaked open just enough to reveal a pair of tired, familiar eyes. Walter. For a moment, he simply stared at her as if he hadn't expected to see her there. Margaret held up the envelope. I got your letter, she said softly. And the check. Walter exhaled slowly, glancing down before nodding. I figured you might. Margaret hesitated, searching his face. I don't understand. You didn't have enough to pay for your groceries last night. But then today, this shows up in my mail. I don't mean to pry, but where did this money come from? Walter's expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might shut the door. But then he let out a weary sigh and stepped back. "Come in," he said. Margaret followed him inside, her heart pounding. The house was small but tidy, though it carried the unmistakable air of loneliness. A single armchair sat near the window, a stack of newspapers beside it. The walls held faded photographs, most in black and white, a life captured in frames, but one that felt long past. Walter motioned for her to sit, then slowly lowered himself into the chair across from her. His hands rested on his knees, his gaze distant. "I don't usually talk about my past," he admitted. "Most people don't ask." Margaret stayed quiet, sensing that he needed time. Walter sighed again, rubbing his hands together. "My wife, she passed away years ago. Cancer." His voice grew thick. "It was just the two of us. No kids, no close family." Margaret swallowed, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "After she was gone, I didn't see much point in things. Just kept going through the motions, living off what little I had left." He shook his head. "Then, last night, you did something I hadn't felt in a long time." Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Walter looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "You made me feel seen." Silence stretched between them. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "You asked where the money came from. The truth is, it was always there. Not a fortune, but enough. My wife and I had savings, but after she died, I didn't see the point in using it. Just let it sit, untouched, until now." Margaret's chest tightened. "Walter, I didn't help you expecting anything in return. You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted gently, "but you reminded me that there's still kindness in the world, and maybe it's time I start being part of it again." Margaret sat in stunned silence, emotions swirling inside her. She had gone looking for answers, but she hadn't expected this. Walter gave her a small, knowing smile. "So, take it, not as payment, not as charity, just as a thank you for reminding an old man that life's not done with him yet." Margaret blinked rapidly, trying to push back the sting of tears. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about money. It was about something far more valuable, a second chance. Margaret sat there, staring at Walter, his words lingering in the quiet room. She had come looking for answers, but she had found something much deeper, a life that had been waiting, untouched, for years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about a man who had been living in the shadow of his past, uncertain if he still had a place in the world. Walter gave her a small, tired smile. "I know this is unexpected, but I've spent so long thinking I had nothing left to give. You reminded me that maybe I do." Margaret swallowed hard. She wanted to protest, to insist that she hadn't done anything extraordinary. But looking at Walter now, she realized that what seemed small to her had meant everything to him. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "I don't want to take something you might need." Walter chuckled softly, shaking his head. "What I need is to know that something good is coming from all of this." He leaned forward slightly. "My wife, Emily, she was the kindest person I ever knew. She always believed in helping people. Even when she got sick, she never stopped finding ways to make someone's day a little brighter." His voice caught for a moment, but he took a breath and continued. "I think she would have liked you." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Walter exhaled slowly, looking around his small home. "For years, I let this house become a place of memories instead of a place to live. Maybe it's time I change that. He met her eyes again. And maybe it's time you stop struggling to get by when you don't have to. Margaret hesitated, emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so long scraping together every paycheck, worrying about rent, about bills, about making ends meet. The idea that someone would choose to help her, it felt almost unreal. But as she looked at Walter, she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about him too. About letting him give, about letting him feel needed again. Finally, she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You know, I came here thinking I was going to help you. Walter chuckled. Funny how life works, isn't it? A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with something unspoken, but understood. Margaret finally nodded. Okay, she said. But only if you promise me something. Walter raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that? She smiled. That we keep in touch. That this isn't just some one-time act of kindness. You still owe me a grocery store visit every now and then. Walter let out a genuine laugh, one that filled the room with warmth. Ideal! Margaret stood, tucking the envelope carefully into her bag. As she walked toward the door, she paused, glancing back at Walter. He looks lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. She smiled. See you soon, Walter. And for the first time in a long time, Walter smiled back. See you soon, Margaret. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, something inside her felt different, lighter. The world had a way of surprising you, of bringing people together in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness could change everything.